We're going to be studying this evening in the 15th book of Yisrayl, Righteousness Prevails. We're in chapter 21, and this sermon is from 8/8/2015. The title is The Vatican, the Serpent, Satan, the Devil is having its way with all nations in this generation. We're going to be picking it up here in this sermon on page 213 and verse 10. And the pastor's talking here about, he's preparing to read an article here regarding the Vatican and some of the news headlines that was things that were going on at that time. And verse 10 he says, I want to show you this one just to remind you of what we're facing and remind you of how big it is. And the article he's reading in italics in the book of Yisrayl here. It says, Vatican signs first treaty with the state of Palestine. That's a pretty significant move on the Vatican's part, and they are promoting the two-state solution here. Now, eventually, you don't see anything from the Vatican. Normally, it's the Pope, the Vatican Santa Claus. And Pastor refers to him as the mouthpiece of the Vatican here because, just like presidents of the United States, they're elected for office the Pope is the same way. He has this huge organization behind him, the Vatican, and the Pope is just the one in charge at that time. The Pope is the Vatican Santa Claus that they push out in front to make these deals, and therefore they can draw back. When you see something that the Vatican, when it actually, where they are actually reporting it, it's big. Now the Vatican has many reporters. It's a huge system that reaches out. Its tentacles reach into all forms of government. Why? Because many members of governments around the world are members of the Roman Catholic Church. The Supreme Courts, from the JP as they're called, Justices of the Peace, they call them up to the Supreme Court. It reaches all of them. And you notice the decision on legalizing gay marriage, and this occurred in 2015, the decision by the Supreme Court of the United States to legalize gay marriage in the United States. As they say legal, there's nothing legal about it. According to the laws of Yahweh, it's not legal, it's illegal. Marriage is between a man and a woman. That's the definition of marriage in Yahweh's laws. And they do this to fool, deceive with these legalizations and say sodomy is okay. Well, on this Supreme Court, out of the 9 people, which is the total number of justices on the Supreme Court of the United States, there are 5 Catholics, 2 Episcopalians, which are nothing but Catholics, pastor is saying, and then they call the other 2 Jews, which are nothing but Catholics. That's all Coptic Catholics. They're all following these same gods, which were brought forth by the Catholic Church. And down to verse 13 here, pastor's showing some of the influence of the Catholic Church when he says, when a Catholic priest appears in an office of a government official, I'm thinking, and says, I have 52,000 people, they want this passed, or I have this many thousand people, and they want this law passed, it is swayed by the Vatican. Turning over to page 214 here, verse 15, but this is for show. It's like the Vatican is nothing but just praying to their gods and praying for you and blessing the poor and kissing babies. I mean, that's all the Vatican is. And there is a lot of showmanship. When you see the Pope traveling the world, big showtime in the presentations that he does around the world. There's a lot of showmanship in the Vatican too when he has his presentations there. They don't show you what's really going on in the Vatican. This is show to keep your mind off of what's going on with that agency. Agency, that's what I'm going to call it from now on, I think, that agency. And then he continues reading the article. Vatican signs first treaty with the state of Palestine. Israel is angered, and they would be, because the Pope, who was a leader of the kings of the earth, he's throwing his weight behind the Palestinians here, and therefore he's coming in this position against the state of Israel. But it says Vatican and Palestinian leaders sign historic first legal treaty. Pope Francis meets with, and Pastor says, oh, that doesn't make any difference. Pope Francis, divorce can be morally necessary to. This is part of the article that he's reading, and then verse 18, U.S. lawmakers, Pope Francis is wrong to legitimize the Palestinians. So everybody's got their different opinions and about what, how to fix the problems in the world, but they don't really have any answers because they leave Yahweh out of their decision-making process. So they come up with answers, but they're not solutions to problems. Well, it wasn't Pope Francis that did this, Pastor says. You just read, it's the Vatican that's doing this, and they're the ones that are controlling the world. They're the ones that are spoken of in Revelation 13, 17, and 18. And why 4 justices were against the Supreme Court's huge gay marriage decision? They had to make it look like they were arguing in there and to bring this about. I guess it made the proponents of democracy feel great to know that, well, it was a 5-4 decision. It was close, but this side won. So we got to accept that decision. Well, Yahweh doesn't accept that decision, and Yahweh's way will prevail. Verse 23, the only one that I can see who is actually with the true answer, the right answer, is Barack Obama. Pastor says, when he says, it's not right to be putting these people in prison, it's not right to be selling these drugs, and what we need is proper education for the people. Yes, the peaceful solution. We need the peaceful solution. The laws of Yahweh is what we need for the people. And the doctors that are selling them the drugs. That's Barack Obama, is what he's saying. Well, that's what we need. The peaceful solution, character education program. And he's the only one who's pushing that forward. And this is what I'm bringing out. None of these things that the Vatican is passing right now is going to help any at all as far as solving that problem. That problem is they're not making enough money, so it's going to solve that problem. It's going to make them more money to what they'd call it here recently when they were taking all this money in the banks here and putting it somewhere else and hiding it and laundering it. And right around this time, there was an article came out that the Vatican found some secret nest egg that was squirreled away in one of their banks, and an extra $1 billion or $2 billion was that they didn't know they had, or at least not everybody knew they had. But verse 25 here, and it says, Pope Francis, God has instructed me to revise the 10 Commandments. Now God, of course, that's not Yahweh, Pastor is saying, and Yahweh is the Creator. Yahweh is in full control, as He shows. And remember, in Revelation, the last chapter in Revelation 22, the last 3 verses of that chapter says that the person, any person, Pope or whatever you want to call yourself, Baptist, Methodist, preachers, whoever follows him in this change, you're as guilty as he is. And Yahweh says eternal life will be taken from you. You're going to be marked as not worthy to receive eternal life. It says it plain. You'd better read it for yourself, all of you preachers that are hearing me out there. The Pope has already changed the commandments. This occurred with Constantine. Now, Pastor makes an interesting point here. The Catholic Bible has 10 commandments, but they don't have the same commandments that the book of Yahweh has. In Exodus chapter 20, the Catholic Bible leaves out the second commandment, which says, "You shall not make for yourself any carved image, an idol, in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below." Now, they leave that commandment out of the Catholic Bible. And so how do they come up with 10? Well, they take the 10th commandment in the book of Yahweh, and they split it into two. They call it 9 and 10. And the 10th commandment is, "You shall not covet, lust after your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, nor his maidservant, nor his manservant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that belongs to your neighbor." And they take that and split it into two. So as Pastor's saying here, they did change it back in Constantine's time already, but now the Pope, to promote his agenda of sodomy, and he's proposing some other changes to the 10 Commandments. So Pastor says, no, Constantine didn't do this on his own. Constantine, history says, was an idiot that the Vatican used like they're using the popes today. And the Vatican chose the two gods to replace Yeshua's name, and they replaced Yahweh's name in the Holy Scriptures. So, though the authorized version, the King James authorized version, does not have Yahweh's name in it. It has the names of lords and gods in it. It's one difference. Okay, and then Pastor makes on page 215, verse 28, he says, in Biblical Archaeology Review, and I brought it out in the Prophetic Word magazine, but it said that there was nothing in the Dead Sea Scrolls that would support Christianity. Well, they kept trying to get the Dead Sea Scrolls translated and out to the people, but that hasn't been successful. On page 216 here, verse 34, but anyway, Pastor says, the Jesuit priesthood, it was invented for the purpose of going and wiping out the enemies of the Vatican. Now that's one thing different about Pope Francis, the current Pope of the Catholic Church. He is a Jesuit, the first Jesuit, first Pope who came from the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church. So, that is a significant difference. So, Francis, he's not only pushing the agenda of the Vatican, but he's pushing the agenda of the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church. Well, it's got big in itself. It's like the ISIS army. Pastor's describing a link, a correlation between the way they operate, the ISIS army and the Jesuit priesthood, or the others that they're calling these enemies that they've got right here. It's got so big that it outweighed the Catholic Church and the Vatican. Well, now, as you can see, they're taking over the Vatican, and they've got a Jesuit Santa Claus out there to send forth to tell the people how holy he is, and God is talking to him and telling him to change these commandments, you see. This is a pretty significant change Pope Francis is proposing, but he's really showing his true colors. He's showing his influence with the Supreme Court decision to legalize gay marriage, and he's showing his true colors with his proposals to change the 10 Commandments to promote sodomy. Well, they still haven't released or translated the Dead Sea Scrolls, and when they sued, they were actually taken to court, and the priests who were in charge of them, the Dead Sea Scrolls, I brought this out years ago. They fired the priest. They fired the Catholic priest, but the Catholic priest wouldn't leave. Nobody went in and got them and took them out. They're still there, and they're still keeping hush-hush about the Dead Sea Scrolls, which don't support Christianity. They were hoping they would, or thinking they would, support the establishment of so-called Christianity, but they don't. The early believers practiced the laws of Yahweh. the early believers practiced the laws of Yahweh just as we here in the house of Yahweh practice the laws of Yahweh. It's the same faith that Yeshua taught the laws of Yahweh. Well, this shows you the same power that they had over the King James Version before they let it out. Finally, it let it out. They were forced to by Yahweh Himself. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a King James Version. But they don't want the Dead Sea Scrolls put out there to back up the book of Yahweh. It may be that Yahweh intends to make them do it or not, but one thing that is going out right now is the book of Yahweh from the house of Yahweh. But he's going to revise the Ten Commandments, and the Supreme Court of the earth and the quartet are going to fall in line with this. According to Revelation, they're going to support this Vatican in doing so. He is the leader of the kings of the earth. He has a tremendous amount of influence among the nations. Doesn't have an army of his own. He's got a personal bodyguard, but he doesn't have an army. But he uses the armies of the world, of the nations, to promote his policies. They started out with building an army. That is, Herod did, the Herodians. They're the ones that had the wealth. I brought this out, the history of it. I showed you that they're the ones that had the wealth. They started the Roman army that would take villages and take their men from these villages and put them in their armies, and kept enlarging their armies. They employed them in their army. They never could squash Jerusalem and Israel. They kept having trouble. And even Herod, when he had his brother's wife and Yochanan went to him, he didn't go to him personally, but he was just preaching. And Herod heard of it, just as, the world is hearing of the message that is being preached by Yahweh's Last Days Witness, Yisrayl Hawkins. And, some of them are loving it and some of them are not. It was the same in the times of Yeshua and Yochanan. And Herod heard of it, and he quickly arrested Yochanan and put him in jail. That's what they do today. Remember, they try to put them in jail and set them on fire, burn them out. But if they want to squash a preacher, and that preacher doesn't have Yahweh's protection, then he's going to jail. And their prisons are where they can get rid of them and keep freedom of speech down. If you get on to verse 41 here, well, here in Yochanan, Mark 7, verse 9, the scripture reads, "Then he said to them, how well you reject the laws of Yahweh, so that you may keep your own traditions." And these are the words of Yeshua, and they're saying the same thing at the Vatican today. Now, this was the Savior doing the speaking, Pastor says. You get that? You see that, all of you? He says even at that time they were rejecting the laws of Yahweh to bring forth their own personal laws. Now, down here in verse 43, then the Pharisees, and this is verse 1 of Yochanan chapter 7, verse 1, then the Pharisees and certain scribes came together to him, having come from Jerusalem. So this is the Vatican. It's speaking of here Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes. Their lawyers are also mentioned. Remember, these are the scribes and Pharisees that eventually were taken to Rome when Jerusalem was conquered by the Roman army in 70 A.D. or 70 A.Y. And so it's the same group of people, the ones that Pontius Pilate, when he was judging Yeshua, and he cried out to the crowd, I'm innocent of this man's innocent blood. I'm not guilty of this man's innocent blood. And the crowd, the Pharisees, Sadducees, the crowd, they said, well, let his blood be upon us and our children. And you have that down to this very day with the children of these people in rulership in the Vatican in Rome, Italy today. So these are the lawyers that turned into judges and go to the Supreme Courts and so forth. Even your Congress, your politicians, many of them are lawyers, and they all go to the Vatican schools to learn their laws. Bill Clinton was went to a Catholic school, Catholic college. And many of them do. Not Yahweh's laws, but the Vatican laws that the Vatican passes in the United States, and they don't know it yet. But these same laws are in Israel, and they're getting stronger and stronger in the land of Israel. And this thing with the Palestinians is just one tiny step towards what they intend to take over. That is the Temple Mount. They want it. The Vatican would love to have control of the Temple Mount, a place of prominence there. They want it, and they want to rebuild that temple in Jerusalem. Well, it failed before because the people were being read the laws daily. That's the reason it failed. Every day that the law was read from the temple in Jerusalem, it was a daily oblation to read that law every day. And the people would come for miles. They'd take their vacations in the temple and hear that law read. So they'd say, why is Herod, he's a king, why has he got his brother's wife? That's committing adultery with her. And they solved that problem. How did they solve it? They put Yochanan in prison, and of course they killed him. Well, the same law is going on here today. Yeshua came the same way, and notice he's teaching that they're doing away with Yahweh's laws. So going back to Yochanan Mark chapter 7 verse 1, then the Pharisees and certain scribes came together to Yeshua, having come from Jerusalem. And verse 6, and Yeshua answered and said to them, well has Isaiah prophesied against you hypocrites. As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Skipping down to verse 49 here, verse 7, but in vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrine the commandments of men. And this is what the Vatican promotes. They're not the commandments of Yahweh. They're the commandments, the writings, the teachings of men. Verse 8, verse 50 here, verse 8 of Yochanan Mark 7, chapter 7. For laying aside, and Pastor comments, they're asking themselves now, why didn't we take the Ten Commandments out of the Bible before we allowed it to be printed? That's what they're screaming at one another. Well, it's your fault, one is saying to the other. No, it's your fault. Them Ten Commandments didn't have to be there. We could have taken all of them out before we allowed King James to authorize it, before we told King James, you can authorize this now. And verse 8 of Yochanan Mark 7, for laying aside the law of Yahweh, you hold the traditions of men. The commandments of men, he just named them the commandments of men. Verse 9, then he said to them, how well you reject the laws of Yahweh, so that you may keep your own traditions. So if we listen carefully to Yeshua's words here, he was speaking to the leaders of the religious leaders in Jerusalem, and he was telling them, you're not keeping the laws of Yahweh. You're keeping your own traditions. And it's true with as Pastor says, the leaders of Yada who reside in Rome today. They're keeping their own traditions. They are not keeping the laws of Yahweh. Verse 53, which is verse 10 here, for Moshe said, honor your father and your mother. Now, verse 13, making the laws of Yahweh of no effect through your traditions you have handed down, and many other similar things you do. And Pastor comments here, he says, you don't see these laws being passed, but they pass the laws in the Vatican. They send their representatives to all the people, to all the lands, to say, This is what we want done. They take it to the politicians who are theirs to begin with, and inside they pretend that they're making a vote when it's already decided what they're going to do. It's decided with the Vatican what they're going to do. The Vatican, Pope Francis was probably not real surprised at the 5-4 decision the Supreme Court came up with here in the United States regarding the legalization of gay marriage in the United States. He probably wasn't decided. He probably knew this is the way it was going to be, turn out. Verse 21 of Yachanan, Mark 7. For from within, out of the heart of men, from his mind proceeds evil thoughts. Proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, and fornication, murders. Verse 22, thefts, lust, wickedness, deceit. Remember that the word deceit, because you're going to see it a lot of it in the next few lessons I give you. And in verse 59, the pastor says, I've seen people come here. Here he's doing a sidebar on marijuana, and he says, I see people coming here and try to get and I try to get them off of marijuana, though many through my preaching, I try to get them to stop it, and they claim that they can, but they never do. It seems like once you get hooked on that, there's something missing in the mind, and it keeps them from getting rid of it, even though they know how evil it is. It's a subtle form of destroying a person's mind, is what it is. And and we need our mind. We need every bit of the blessings that Yahweh gave us in our ability to think and to make correct judgments and keeping the laws of Yahweh. We need every bit of the blessings of our thinking that Yahweh put there. And marijuana degrades that. It degrades it. So the pastor continues here. They knew that before they came to that stage, but now they can't think. They can't reason. They can't control their body to where they can actually stop it anymore. And I've noticed they die early. So pastor's exhorting us to, stay away from sorcery. So continuing down here, or just to make one more point here with respect to his article here. And he says, modern society, this is part of the article that Pope Francis put out. Modern society, the Pope spoke about the importance of family in modern society. Now, pastor says, now what he's speaking about here, when he says modern, he means man with man, sodomy, that's modern society. That's what he's referring to. It needs to be helped and strengthened, the article says. And pastor says, that is, he wants them to strengthen sin. That's the reason he wants to wipe out the 10 Commandments. The Vatican, not the Pope, he's their spokesman. The Pope couldn't care less. He's just doing his job because he gets paid for doing his job, and he gets to enjoy the riches of the Catholic Church. Men, that's the information in that from the first part of this chapter this evening. So if you'd all please stand, I'd like to introduce for our second teacher, the great Kohan Betziel Hawkins.
Shalom, everyone. You may be seated. We're going to continue here with the 15th book of Israel, chapter 21, on page 221. Now, Pastor is he's addressing some comments in an article here. And something that we've come to realize in this time period that we're living in is that we have to question our news sources. And we've seen this in the news coming out, and we question whether or not the reporting is accurate. But one thing's for certain is that we see a mixture of the facts and fiction is allowed to confuse the minds of the people and to confuse the truth and to cause the people to doubt and to question everything. You may have heard the saying, truth is stranger than fiction. And what Pastor brings forth is the truth. And the truth is the Catholic Church has been changing the laws of Yahweh throughout history. This has been pretty firmly established, that they're always opposing Yahweh. Now, the Vatican, like Satan, feigns or fakes their innocence. And you ever find it interesting? You know, Satan, we know, has the ability to travel wherever Yahweh allows her to travel. And from what we've learned, there's other places and other things in the universe to go and see, but she devotes her time here with mankind. So we must be pretty significant, don't you think? And though the Vatican feigns their innocence, it's innocent like a pope, but guilty of all the blood of the saints. Now, are they just rumors? Has the shape of history already been cast by her? We can look up the history books and we can see the Crusades. We can see the murders of the innocent. How they've judged those worthy or not worthy to live on their own, for their own gain, without regard to teaching or educating or the laws of Yahweh at all. I wanted to look at something here in Daniel about this kingdom that Pastor is speaking of in this lesson here tonight. In chapter 3 and verse 7 of Daniel, therefore at the time they heard the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, psaltery, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now, this is the time of Daniel when the king had put out a decree that this was what was to be done to worship their gods. And did you notice something interesting here? All the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped. They were all involved in this. And does that sound familiar? You should be thinking of Revelation about the waters, the multitudes, nations, and tongues. And then in Daniel 7 and verse 7, and after this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible and exceedingly strong, and had great iron teeth, and devoured and broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with his feet. It was different from all the beasts before it, and had 10 horns. And I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them a little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first plucked up by the roots. And behold, this horn were eyes, like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So we see a spokesman here. And I beheld until the thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days did sit, whose vesture was white as snow, and hair of his head like pure wool, and his throne was like a fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. So we see a change here, that this beastly system existed up until a point in time. In verse 12, as concerning the rest of the beasts, they had their governments taken away, yet their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. And I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man came with clouds in heaven, and came to the Ancient of Days, and they were brought together before him, and there was given him ruling authority and glory and a kingdom that, and here it is again, all peoples, nations, and languages should obey him. His government is an everlasting government which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. So you see a difference in kingdoms here. You see two kingdoms. One is to fall and one is to rise up and to continue. So one fails and the other succeeds. And if you're not in the house of Yahweh or have contact with the house of Yahweh, there's no way you would realize this. Now, in Zechariah chapter 8 and verse 10 and 11, for before those days there was no reward or salvation from Yahweh for man, because the mouths of those who to preach the reward or salvation from Yahweh were silent. So just a moment ago we saw that this beast had a mouth that spoke, but we saw that there was two kingdoms, and now this one these mouths were silent for a time. Neither was there any peace because of the enemy. And they're calling for peace in the world today, but there cannot be peace until we fill in this void here, this lack of one that can preach the reward of salvation from Yahweh. Because of the enemy who turned every man each against his brother. But now I will not deal with the residue of this people as in former days, says Yahweh of hosts. And the Kahan before me talked about the importance of Yahweh's protection. And I want to put great emphasis on that, the importance of that, how real that is, Yahweh's protection. Yahweh is protecting his house for a purpose. Not so that we can go off and do our own thing, but so that we can do the work of Yahweh. And we need to pray that Yahweh will restrain the adversary so that we can complete our work. This is vitally necessary to bring this peace and to bring the end to suffering and to restore the laws. For the seed will grow successfully, the vine will give her fruit, the ground will give her increase, and the heavens will give their due. Let's see. Okay. So this time that we just see here is different. Now, just a couple more here in Revelation 13. Okay, well here I just wanted to point out the similarities. Speaking of the sea, the waters, that which you saw were the nations, people, and tongue. And they all followed this beast. And this is what we see in the world today, everyone following the beast. And you can see how much attention they give to the Catholic Church and to the Pope, because everything he says, they believe it. They take it as what it is the God spell. And they conduct their lives accordingly. And this is why there's so much promiscuity, there's so much permissiveness, so much iniquity, so much licentiousness, because this power, this beast that the people look up to, is giving them permission to trample upon the laws of Yahweh and to change them up every which way they choose. Look at how many different versions of the scriptures, and some would say the perversions of the scriptures that are written and published today to match any custom or tradition of men. And in Revelation 17:15, of course, well, I covered that. Okay, so, but notice, and the 10 horns which you saw upon the beast, these will hate the whore, and will make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. But Yahweh has put it in their hearts to perform their will and to agree and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words or prophecies of Yahweh be fulfilled. And the woman you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. And you can can do a search on Israel Says about any part of this topic and get a great amount of information about this. Remember what Yahweh says, what Yeshua said. You know, when they bring this trouble upon the people, when they bring this oppression upon the people by bringing these lies and changing the laws and perverting justice, Yeshua said, if you've done it to the least, you've done it unto me. And so, as low as they might esteem their neighbor or a member of the house of Yahweh, Yeshua said, if you've dishonored or have cheated or disrespected even the least of these, or cursed them, or persecuted them, you've done it unto the Savior himself. If you kept the seventh-day Sabbath, and the neighbors, if they saw you keeping the Sabbath and resting on the seventh-day Sabbath, that was a part of the restrictions that the Pharisees, when they polluted the Sabbath, and they found out others were keeping it, they bring the judicial system against them. I was telling our children that I was teaching a class last week how when I was their age, you know, growing up in grade school, I was taken out of school whenever they had their Christmas parties and birthdays and things like this. And whenever I'd come back after the Christmas break, my peers would always ask me, well, did you get everything you wanted for Christmas? And I finally got wise to that after a few years of that. I prepared an answer. And so one day I came back and I said, yes, I got exactly what I wanted. And they were like, oh, really? What was that? And I said, absolutely nothing. And they were like, what? And I just tell them, I don't keep that tradition. I don't celebrate Christmas. And they're like, wow, you know, what's that like, you know? But that put a mark on me. And so it would get around the school, and then it would go home to their parents and say, hey, I met this kid today, and he doesn't keep Christmas. And the parents are like, oh, really? And then it would get around to my mother, you know, and people would gossip and talk. But what I was telling the children, the difference was that just in 2 generations, I could do that and get away with it without my life being threatened for the most part. I mean, sometimes people would get upset and want to beat me up, but, you know, in my grandparents' time, they had to hide, and my parents even kept themselves hidden like pastors' parents did out of fear of persecution. But, I mean, for them it was much worse. Their lives were actually on the line, and they actually fled their countries to come to a remote land, you know, in the midst of God worship here, to kind of keep themselves protected. But there was a change in this time period, and that change allowed, regrettably, it allowed a lot of sin, but it also allowed religious freedoms to a certain extent. So throughout my life, I started to see more and more of a relaxing of this persecution against those who were keeping the laws or trying to keep, like, the Sabbath or the feast days and things like this. And now, you know, it's pretty commonplace. See, we even have a president that's aware of the Sabbath and the name of Yahweh and so forth. So this is why I stress the importance of Yahweh's protection. If it weren't for Yahweh's protection, we would not be allowed to do that. And we wouldn't have been allowed to live. But, you know, it's not like we're living in a complete safe zone. We have to be, you know, wise and harmless. But and the best way to be wise and harmless is to be equipped with knowledge that you're taught here in the house of Yahweh. And because they can dream up all kinds of things. And, you know, this very week, you know, I was reading about things that they're dreaming up in their laws to bring persecution against people. And, you can see why Daniel, in his visions, he saw these many laws and he was very concerned about it. And of course, as we saw there in Daniel 3, they set these things in society to steer the minds and the opinions of the people. So when you encounter the people and you try to represent Yahweh's laws or teach Yahweh's laws, right away you meet up with some resistance. But thankfully, the house of Yahweh's message is becoming more and more effective and reaching more and more people. More and more people are questioning what they've been taught. And so this is the exposure that pastor is giving and the Pope, and making him give an answer for these lies and this mixture of truth and deception that he's allowing to be brought forth and confusing the minds of the people with. You saw what they did to the people who were using the name of Yahweh while the house of Yahweh has been in existence in this time period. And you saw, and of course we've discussed this here tonight, but continuing here on page 223 and verse 87, I want to show you another form that this persecution takes. You remember the book that Malachi Martin wrote, and I thought I had the whole thing written down, but I guess I didn't, or I put it somewhere else. But the thing is, here verse 87, to the members of the NATO defense. The NATO defense is just one army that the Vatican actually controls and was set up to bring about the Vatican's will. And if you'll search, let's see, Malachi Martin's book, Competition, three-way competition. If you there's much to be read about this topic if you search competition, the word competition in the book of Israel Says. But I wanted to give you a little background on NATO. It started in 1948 as the Treaty of Brussels, or the Mutual Defense Pact. It was an anti-communist movement to try to keep a handle on the of Russia and communism and the spread of such. And it went through several iterations involving different countries. In 1955, they entered phase 1, and they went all the way through phase 5 in 2009, which added, among other nations, Albania, Croatia, and what we saw occurring at this point was the post-Soviet expansions seemed unnecessary, but this is not the case. NATO held together and continued, even expanded, even in absence of any clear objective. Now, this is kind of interesting to me because the 7-year plan, is there any reason why that 7-year plan would continue to crop up year after year after year? They continue to hammer that peace plan. It keeps, you think, any other plan, they've just discarded them. They've just passed them by and they become a part of history, but not this one. It keeps coming up and is reiterated. And here we see the same thing with NATO, even though there's not a clear reason, because the Soviet dominance and strength kind of dissolved by the 90s. Why did NATO persist? And it was questioned why it would even persist, and yet it did. Oh, here it is. But listen to the title of The Keys of This Blood by Father Malachi Martin. The Struggle for World Domination Between Pope John Paul II, Mikhail Gorbachev, and the Capitalist West. Three-way competition. Russia is now experiencing geopolitical anxiety fueled by constant NATO expansion, especially since Georgia wants into NATO. Georgia is deep within Russia, the birthplace of Stalin, and held for the entire 19th century by Russia. Ukraine also had attempted membership, but dropped it. Ukraine and Russia closely entwined. While Ukraine has reapplied for membership, NATO alliance continues to poke at Russia in this way. And so here you see this power that the Vatican army has to bring about the Vatican's will. And they're just poking at that bear and continuing to antagonize it. The Vatican reaches out into all the world. It's not a tiny thing that we're up against here. It's controlling right now even the United States, or the Western, as Malachi Martin's title put it, capitalist West. So under this system that they have set up, and we've got to remember this, the way they've got it set up, it makes no difference if a president or a congressman or a senator objected to their ways. You know, every once in a while you'll get one that'll come in and raise an objection. You know, he has some morality left, but they're just one person. But the Vatican has enough votes to get what it wants, like the Supreme Court. If one or two of them say, oh no, you know, this is evil, we don't want this, it would still pass. Even if they objected, they went ahead and voted for this evil, pushing aside Yahweh and his laws for this tradition of sodomy. And if you don't think it's a tradition, read Jeremiah 23:15. And I also point out here Matthew 15:9 and Yachanan Mark 7:7, which you recall talks about teaching traditions as commandments. You know, teaching the tradition of men as commandments, making the people think that it's holy or righteous to celebrate a false, you know, a god, or these false traditions. But notice here, he talks in verse 91 about the pharmaceutical drugs. Now the quartet is shown, and their nuclear war is shown, and a third part of man will be killed by famine and nuclear war and disease epidemics. And then in Revelation 9:20, here we see the drug dealing that is going on, the pharmaceuticals, and the people dying from doctors' prescriptions. I think my brother was killed in that manner. They have medicines that they claim will heal, but there's no healing medicines. They bring forth side effects. And the thing I wanted you to notice here is that in none of these situations, none of these experts and professionals and so forth stand in the counsel of Yahweh. And I'd like to point out, here in the house of Yahweh, we have various departments. And can you think of one department in the house of Yahweh that does not stand in the counsel of Yahweh? I cannot think of one. They're all answerable to a priest, and ultimately to the chief priest in our day, you know, the one spokesman, the highest priest we have here before us in the flesh, being Israel Hawkins, and who represents the truth and the laws and teaches it to everyone, and brings that forth relentlessly. And so all of this trouble, and we see it in and around the river Euphrates, and the rest of the men who were not killed by these plagues still did not repent, still would not stand in the counsel of Yahweh. And then we see demons in Revelation 12:9. The ones called demons, they are gods that actually followed Lucifer, Hillel, Yahweh's wife, as shown in Isaiah 14 and many other places. And we can see this spoken of in Yeketska 28 as well. So all of these evils we see because iniquity is abounding. Matthew 24:12. Remember then, iniquity is pushing aside the laws so you can bring forth man's laws. They would not repent of their sorceries nor of their fornication, which is idolatry. Read the note in your book of Yahweh, and it tells us there in Revelation 9:21 that this fornication is idolatry. And they still will not repent of all this. Now, Revelation 13, here we see an agency or a beastly system. And it says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw this beast rise up out of the sea." Now, Pastor calls this an agency and shows this sea is multitudes, nations, and tongues. That is where it rose up out of. Now, an agency is one who acts on behalf of another in dealing with others. So this could be like Pastor acting on behalf of Yahweh in dealing with us, or it could be the Pope or the Vatican, or the Pope acting on behalf of the Vatican, dealing with the people, and so forth, to carry out a purpose. Now, all of this in this time period is being revealed because the last days house of Yahweh has been established in this Babylonish land, has been established, set into place. And this whole plan he revealed to his servants, the prophets, beforehand. Now we're talking about a being here who can look down in the future and tell you, and he can even look at you and tell you how many hairs you've got in your head. And you think when Yahweh spoke to Daniel or revealed to Daniel in a vision his plan of these last days and of Pastor's work, when you think about how aware Yahweh is of his plan in every detail, this is how he was able to reveal the detailed visions to his prophets. That to Yahweh, he doesn't just see things as we see them, like, oh, I have an idea what I'm going to do in a couple of days, or, oh, I remember, what it was like. But Yahweh sees things as though they actually exist, with that clarity. And this is how he could show things to Daniel, because he could foresee these things. Yahweh could put and impress this in his mind to see these things like a movie, like it was actually before him, before it even occurred. That's the power of Yahweh. Now, in the meantime, we have this power standing and influencing the nation and ruling with authority. Not just anyone can do this, but the dragon gave him his power. Satan gave him this power. The Vatican is the strongest system that Satan could ever devise. So we see Yahweh allowed this power to come forth. And, of course, everyone is affected, and it takes in everyone, even the Muslims, they're all being controlled by this system. They're all going to be pulled in by it. So if we don't subject ourselves to the house of Yahweh, we're going to be subjecting ourselves to this system of Satan and deceived by it. Only Yahweh has accurately foretold all the events of this time period, and he's documented them in these books for us. It's no secret that this serpent is working through the Vatican and changing the laws and deceiving the people with it. It's no mystery to the house of Yahweh. Well, the Vatican has brought the world down to this mess that we're living in right now. but not under their own authority. They had authority, but it was from the gods, and they turned from Satan, the beastly system, or the Leviathan, another mystery. And so this is something else that Israel is going to explain to us about these who prophesied lies, who are always learning but never able to come to the knowledge of the truth, as it says in 2 Timothy 3:7. So with that, I'm out of time. May Yahweh bless your understanding.